Okay, folks, so very interesting presentation for today. Well, a very interesting book. I don't know if the presentation is going to be that interesting. It's called Tea War by Andrew B. Liu. कितने लोगों ने पढ़ी किताब या reading की है? Congratulations, one person. इनको grade देते हैं और मैं घर चला जाता हूँ. Thank you. All right, so let's have a look at this work. In the introduction, Andrew Liu tells us that people ask in the world today, is there tea in China? This is a very strange question because the origins of tea are in fact in China. And for people today to ask whether China has tea is so weird because that's where it all began. But it also signifies something else. It signifies the almost complete eclipse of the production and trade of tea by the Chinese. And so let's try and unpack that and unravel that and see what we can understand with respect to tea wars. So I think the author would like to make two distinct points, although they are very interrelated. The first is a point about capitalism in general, and the second point is about what happened during these tea wars. And you'll see that both of them are connected to each other. Let's start with the most general point about capitalism. So you might remember the other day, Amina asked, and others also asked, what is the exact definition of capitalism? I even made a video on it. And we had a reading by Carol Heim that was talking about what capitalism really is. And if you recall, I said capitalism is basically when labor becomes a commodity, that is, labor becomes labor power, it can be bought and sold on the market. And that is the key aspect of capitalism. Now you may ask, if the sale and purchase of labor is the defining feature of capitalism, then what about the cotton plantation, slave colonies of the South, of the American South? Are those not part of capitalism? On the one hand, all of that system depends on this horrific form of slavery. On the other hand, we also know that the production from the cotton plantations is very much part of the global capitalist trade and the system of global capitalism. Not only in the sense that the very commodities are going as a supply chain into the industries of Lancashire and so on, not only in the sense that the profits from that are then used, the cotton produced there is then is then sold in Africa, from which slaves are bought, and then the slaves are sold again to the American, the plantation owners on the American continent. But also insofar as the very people who are actuating this entire process of international trade and production are, by all standards that we can understand, essentially capitalists themselves. They are part of the bourgeoisie, they're not feudal lords, etc., etc. They are either merchants and traders, but the merchants and traders are connected to industrial capitalism, which is at the heart of this entire system. So then the question arises, how do we define or understand capitalism? If we only want to talk about wage labor, and we can do that, and that's not wrong, we would commit one historical, we would be committing ourselves to a kind of, we would be blinded to the fact that, all right, that happened, the Industrial Revolution and so on, but that was intricately connected to a whole global trade network, to a whole supply chain in which people were working in other parts of the world in very different conditions. They were not working as wage laborers, they were working as serfs in the context of Eastern Europe, where we talk about the second serfdom. They are working as slaves when we talk about the American continent. And they are working in all sorts of other family labor and all sorts of other labor relations and indentured labor and all kinds of other conditions all over the world wherever this thing is occurring, wherever these international traders are going. So in that context then, if in classical political economy, also in nationalist discourse, merchant capital, unlike modern industrial capitalism or capitalists or capital, is not considered to be highly productive. Why? Because industrial capital gets into the process of production and begins to alter it with technical innovations. So writes Karl Marx also in, as you can see, in Das Kapital, which was part of your reading. So it begins to change the very technique of production. Whereas what we see over here is arguably not so much a change in the technique of production, although we will argue the opposite side in just a little bit, but just that this vast trade is taking place and the way in which production is occurring seems to be pre-capitalist, but then it's feeding into this global capitalist system. So how do we really understand this? He says, so merchant capital did not intervene into production and hence could not improve it through vertical integration or labor-saving technology. So merchant capital isn't, in theory, supposed to change the way in which the actual process of production occurs. It's only supposed to buy and sell, buy and sell. And of course, that's very, very important. But the innovation, the innovative side of capital, the aspect of capitalism that we associate with technological growth and innovation is not supposed to occur in this particular branch of capital. It's supposed to occur at the level of industrial capitalism itself. To make it very clear once again, what is the difference between industrial capitalism and merchant capitalism? Merchant capitalism or mercantilism is just the process of buying and selling. Just buying and selling, commerce, commercialization, all of these words mean the same thing. The process of buying and selling, especially in a big scale. But industrial capitalism is something quite different. It is when the process of production takes place. So merchants are not supposed to be doing production. Capitalists do production, okay? But merchant capital gets connected with industrial capitalism, and that connection actually is very, very important and needs to be understood and studied. And when capitalism emerged, it's not like that happened sometime later. Capitalism emerges with these two things in connection and close connection with each other. Now, that doesn't mean that merchant capitalism only comes about with capitalism. As Marx elaborates in Capital, Volume 3, Chapter 20, merchant capitalism has existed for a long, long time. He says that ancient Rome में भी merchant capitalism था. You know, merchant capitalists have existed in many, many different civilizations. And ज़्यादातर वहाँ पे जब merchant capitalism got the upper hand, it would result in other people just getting lost in slavery and in other kinds of. Merchant capital on its own, according to Marx, did not have the capacity to transform the mode of production itself, the way in which production was occurring. It had the capacity to connect, obviously, various modes of production, or to connect a mode of production within itself, but it did not have the capacity on its own to change the technique, the way in which production occurs. That occurs with industrial capitalism. However, this is the assumption that this study will challenge and show that merchant capital works through the intensification of labor exploitation. So what this study will try to show is that merchant capital, although it was not introducing any new machinery, but it was changing the way in which production was occurring. It was changing the way production was occurring all across the third world, in China, in India, the American South we've already discussed. So what was going on in China, in India is our interest now. It may not necessarily have introduced new machinery in the same way as was introduced during the Industrial Revolution by industrial capitalists. But that does not mean that no changes in the way in which production occurred, that there were no changes in the way in which production occurs. Ji.
We associate a more broader definition of capital to be one, specialization, regardless if it's industrial or not, specialization, and secondly, production for the sake of sale as opposed to exchange.
If you amend, look, the thing is that you can, if you like, to redefine capitalism any way, which way you want. In social sciences in general, people do have the freedom to redefine a concept. But the issue I always have with redefining concepts is that the thing that you're describing becomes something different. So if you describe capitalism one way, and I describe capitalism in another way, and then we start arguing with each other about capitalism and what it does, what it doesn't do, the fact of the matter is that you're talking about a different phenomena than the one I am talking about. This is what you have to understand. When you change the definition of something, you stop arguing about the same thing, you're arguing about different things. Okay? So my understanding, and the way I would like to do this reading, is that I'm not necessarily going to change the definition of capitalism, but I am going to I am going to bring into examining when I examine the history of capitalism, how it emerged. I want us to be able to understand that although capitalism is wage labor, but you cannot fail to but notice that it emerges in conjunction with getting a hold of all other sorts of labor regimes in addition to wage labor. That wage labor, somehow or the other, in the historical evolution of capitalism, is connected to all the other forms of exploitation, including slavery, including indentured labor, and so much else. Okay? And that kind of work was not just occurring in the same way that it occurred before. So if there was serfdom before, if there was indentured labor before, or if there was slavery before, when capitalism gets a hold of those things, these older modes of production, when capitalism gets the hold of these older modes of production, it subjects them now to a new rhythm, to a new pace of work. Because of course that the system is being driven by that logic of accumulation. So it's not just that capitalism has gotten a hold of the old mode of production and everything is going the same way as it was before. No. It's gotten a hold of the old mode of production. It hasn't yet completely transformed it into capitalism, but it has intensified and accelerated the way in which labor is occurring, even in that old mode of production. So it does not leave it unchanged. It begins to transform it, and that's what we need to understand about how capitalism, sort of becomes a hybrid sort of system, or takes a hold of the older mode of production and begins to transform it in a new way. Yes.
So, so I had a question. Capitalism is taking a hold of older modes of production.
G.
And there is no wage labor involved yet. Then what is the capitalism that is taking a hold of the older mode of production? Like, what do you define that capitalism as?
Correct. So that capitalism that's getting a hold of this older mode of production are merchants. It's merchant capitalism that's getting a hold of this older mode of production. But that merchant capitalism is not just the old kind of merchant capitalism that just existed. It's now connected to the Industrial Revolution and the industrial capitalism that has come about. So it's a merchant capitalism feeding into industrial capitalism. So the merchants are not just buying and selling cotton in the same way as cotton was bought and sold in the past. They're buying and selling cotton now for the Lancashire mills to be processed there. That has made all the difference in the world because the pace of that completely transforms now. Okay? So let's go on. So how is this done? For example, by mechanisms such as absorbing household labor, for example, the labor of women and children into sideline activities, reallocating labor into more profitable sectors, measuring and regulating the time of specialized tasks, and decreasing the time and increasing the pace of work through extra economic coercion. In other words, it happens through all sorts of methods through which the pace of work is intensified, speeded up. So, what we need to recognize is that the rise of global capitalism has involved all forms of coerced and unfree labor. एक तरफ free labor है. What we mean by free labor isn't that the laborer is, yay, I'm free, I'm so happy. That's not what it means. What free labor means is that the person is free of the means of production. They do not have any means, any muashi wasail, any means through which they can convert their labor into the things that the labor makes. For that process to occur, for them to labor, they need somebody else. And what do they need someone else? They need someone to give them the means of production on which they can labor, and that can convert things into the products that they want to sell. Yes. Okay, I'll say it again. So this is called the realization of labor. Okay, I'm a laborer. I am a certain kind of laborer. Let's say I'm a teacher, okay? Or let's say I'm a tailor, or let's say I'm a bricklayer. I cannot do those things without certain conditions being present. I need certain raw materials, and I need certain tools. I need certain economic resources to be able to work, Okay? As a brick maker, for example, I'm going to have to need access to clay, simply land where I can work, make the bricks. As a tailor, I'm going to need access to cloth. I'm going to need my scissors. I'm going to need my tools, all of these things. Wherever you do any work, even if it's work of just sitting on a computer and making a computer program or writing an essay, you still need certain things. Even with the minimum thing, you need a pen, you need paper, you need a place to sit. You can't just work in the air. And the bigger you go, the more resources you may need. So to do agriculture, what do I need? Land. I can't do agriculture without land. So if I'm a farmer, if I'm a peasant, if I'm an agriculturalist, I need land. Now I don't have that land. Who has that land? The landlord has that land. So I will have to go to the landlord and say, here I am, I'm a tailor, I'm a peasant, I'm a farmer, I'm a teacher. Hire me. I'll make this for you. I'll teach the classes. I'll cut the cloth. I'll till the fields. And then you get hired, and then you can convert your labor into something that can be useful to people.
No, what I did not understand is like, इसे हम free labor क्यों कह रहे हैं? क्योंकि labor तो यही होती है.
Free labor इस sense में कह रहे हैं that the laborer, number one, is free of the means of production. Okay? It's not a positive way that you're using this word. To be free of the means of production is not a positive thing. It means that you're deprived of the means of production, correct? Like the enclosures that deprive the peasants from the land. But on the other hand, also you are free to be able to sell your labor to anybody. So if I was a slave, I can't go and say, excuse me, sir, hire me, because I belong to somebody else already. Yeah, so I'm free in the double sense, in the sense that I need to go and sell my labor, and free also in the sense that I can go and sell my labor. In these double senses, when I'm free, that's when I become a wage laborer. That's the definition of capitalism.
When someone is like free labor, and like if we put that circumstance of a wage labor as well, would they be getting money like for the work that they're putting in, or is it like the bonding system in ho jata?
No, they'll get money for it, like a wage. They'll get a wage. That's right. Okay. So what I'm trying to explain to you now is, yeah, that's capitalism, but that's accompanied by all of this other stuff: slavery from the African to the American continent, and unfree and indentured labor in Asia. All these other horrible things are going on that cannot be defined by this relationship of the wage, employee and employer. Lots of people are part of this global capitalist system that are not employees. Especially the earlier you go in history, that's a fact. So how do we understand that, Ji?
तो इस लाइन में what we're trying to say is कि एक तरफ दुनिया में अनफ्री लेबर की वजह से दूसरी तरफ दुनिया में इंग्लैंड में फ्री लेबर पैदा हुआ.
हाँ, it's unfree and free labor seem to be part of this massive global system.
जैसे कि आज भी
जैसे कि कुछ आज भी ऐसे है बहुत सारी जगहों. Okay, so to leave out this complex of unfree labor would leave out a vital aspect of the rise and development of global capitalism. So when we study capitalism, normally we only study, oh, this wage labor developed in Europe and that's how capitalism develops. That's only half the story. The other half of the story is the slavery on the plantations of the American continent. The other half of the story is what happened in China. The other half of the story is what happened in India, what happened in Africa. That's part of the story of the rise of capitalism. To truncate that and to not talk about that and say, oh, capitalism just arose in Lancashire, this mill was created, that's capitalism, is to forget that mill in Lancashire was connected in a trade system and in a global supply chain to many other parts of the world. You should not leave that out if you want a real and holistic analysis of capitalism. That's the point.
But eventually, all unfree labor was too rigid for that.
Eventually, unfree labor, as things industrialize, the theory is that it would be too rigid for it, like we saw with respect to the United States of America. But also, it leaves open another interesting question, which is that so many parts of the world remain unindustrialized, and hence also unfree labor remains the case in so many parts of the world despite 200 years of now capitalism or more. So that's an interesting question that we can look at later on. Yes.
Especially in this holistic and global picture of capitalism, can we argue that industrial capitalism was indeed a step towards labor rights and human rights?
Not yet.
Because it is freeing a big chunk of the population from slavery, indentured labor, and serfdom.
Not yet because
Free form of labor.
Not yet because their conditions of life are no better, although they are now considered, now they are considered to be free people, but their conditions of life are no better. So in terms of social status, they stand one step ahead of slavery, but in terms of their economic status, they actually could stand one step behind slavery and even other pre-capitalist forms of oppression. This is a funny and confusing and interesting thing. But for example, in patriarchal slavery, if I buy you as a slave और आप 2 साल में मर जाएं तो मेरा तो नुकसान हो जाएगा ना. So I'm going to make sure that you do what I tell you to do, but I want you to live your 40 years out. I'm not going to allow you to starve, for instance. So in feudalism, the serf wouldn't starve, and even in slavery, unless something happened, which was a kehet or something, in the normal course of action, you wouldn't want your slave to starve unless they rebelled or something and you killed him, right? So in that sense, if you recall from my lecture on Polanyi, I explained that the older modes of production were in a sense relatively more secure for the underprivileged, even though the underprivileged in terms of social status was below the lord and the master, etc., etc. It's a kind of ironic sort of thing that even though you transition from being a serf to becoming a wage laborer, and wage laborer, is a higher step in terms of social standing, but the serfs were economically safer than the wage laborers. कितनी अजीब सी बात है. In fact, when this transition occurred, millions of people were destroyed. Their economic livelihood was destroyed. They wanted to go back to serfdom. कि वो बेहतर था. कितनी irony की बात है, दिलचस्प बात है. So, and that's also the reason why a lot of these transitions have to occur with an incredible amount of social force being applied to them. Because if they were good for everybody, then people would say, yay, capitalism, I'm way better off. But they're not always better off, which is why capitalism so many times has to be shoved down people's throats. Yes.
सर जो आजकल सप्लाई चेन्स पे फॉर एग्जांपल जब हम बात करते हैं कि नाइकी वगैरह स्वेट शॉप्स में काम करवाते हैं तो आप उन लेबरर्स को फ्री लेबर्स
Yes, those are free laborers. At least in the MNCs, etc., they are under contract. They're employees of that firm, etc. Although they're working horrible hours there, and so on. It's a sweatshop. The conditions of labor are terrible, but they are not slaves in the sense of you cannot buy that person. You cannot buy the person. You can buy from the market the labor of that person, i.e. the labor power.
considered coerced labor क्योंकि बच्चे भी काम कर रहे हैं.
See, that's what you have to understand. Free labor does not mean that the labor is now somehow free and happy. Get that out of your mind. What you mean by free labor is simply that they're not a slave, they are free of the means of production, and they are free to sell their labor power. It does not necessarily mean that they are better off, that they are in freedom. Please don't confuse those two things. Their economic conditions may be worse than before. Okay? They may be worse than the slaves. They may be worse than the serfs. They may be worse than other forms of unfree labor. But they are free in, this is in inverted commas that we're putting the word free. Okay? They are free. You're free to starve. That's what free means here. Okay? All right. So, a new global history of labor shows how these unfree forms of labor were bound up with the rise of global capitalism. That's what we want to show. All right? So now let's talk about the history of tea. And before I start talking about tea, anybody drinking tea here? Who's a tea drinker over here? Okay. Who has now switched to coffee? Okay. Who doesn't drink either tea or coffee? So history of tea is very interesting. Did you know that Pakistan is one of the largest importers of tea? We literally spend millions of dollars buying tea. I don't forget what the exact number is. It's like 600 or 800 million dollars. I think 600 or 700 million dollars we spend on buying tea. Did you know that? Yeah. So next time, that's why S.N. Iqbal once said, "Ji, ek cup chai piye, do cup chai na piye." And then he got caught at McDonald's with Taimur Rahman over there at Behra interchange. But he was buying coffee, I can tell you. He wasn't buying tea. Coffee. Where did coffee start? Just out of curiosity. America?
South America, I think.
South America?
Actually, it was very common in Iran coffee in the
Yes.
coffee houses and Arabs.
Yeah, it was very common in the Middle East. Coffee went to Europe because of the Muslims. Yeah, it's a very Muslim drink. Next time, don't think I'm being all American. Say this is, but they used to drink it black, by the way. Don't put any, milk and sugar in it. That's not how it was drunk originally. It was just black. Yes.
So there's also this interesting thing about how you pronounce this. So the countries where it came by sea, it's called like cha or chai, like from that pronunciation, and those where like places where it was imported, and from places where it was homegrown or exported, they were called like cha or tea.
But tea is different, coffee is different. But yes, I'm going to come to just that in just a little bit, okay? So, history of tea. Let's have a look. So, the tea plant, which is the Camellia sinensis, sorry if I mispronounced that, had been cultivated and consumed in East Asia for over a millennium before it became a truly global commodity in the 17th century. So, if coffee comes from the Arabs, etc., where does tea come from? East Asians, the Chinese and the Vietnamese and the Koreans, etc., and the Japanese, they were drinking tea for 1,000 years before anybody else knew about tea. जी.
But the black tea, the chai in India.
अभी आते हैं ना, chill. European and American aristocrats grew enamored with tea as part of an early modern worldwide craze for drug foods, including coffee, opium, what? Chocolate, what? Tobacco, what? Sugar. Yeah, these are all considered hello drug foods because they why do they consider drug foods? Amal has rahi hai. Kyun Amal? She can't help herself. Chocolates are drug foods. I love chocolates, by the way. Why? They're really good. Yes.
They're considered deeply addictive.
They are addictive and they change your state of mind. Okay? Every time you have any one of these foods, coffee, wakes you up suddenly, opium, never mind. Chocolate also wakes you up, etc. Tobacco, kind of mellows you out. Sugar wakes you up, called a sugar high. So these are all drug foods, okay? They are stimulants and depressants incorporated into everyday rituals. So we have drugs all the time. They're not hard drugs, they're like soft drugs, right? For nearly 2 centuries, British and kitne khush hue sare? I don't know why. For nearly 2 centuries, British and Dutch merchants purchased Chinese tea from a collection of 13 houses that controlled the southern port of Canton. Okay? So they would go and buy this tea. They're like, oh my God, I want to have tea. Oh, I feel so revived. આજકાલ we don't really think about it in the same way. Tea has just become so normal that we don't really revel when we... Do you? Maybe you do. You're like, yaar, acha cup of chai ho jaye. Lipton hi janab or something. I don't know. What are the other ads for tea?
कपाल का बस एक कप चाय.
दाने दाने पर पीने वाले का नाम लिखा है or whatever. But there was a time when you drank tea, it was like almost like a holy experience or like a, really wonderful experience or something. And same with other things, coffee and chocolates. And ये तो अब आम हो गई है ना. अब पहले आम नहीं थी. These were like really special things. Okay. So on the supply side of this Canton system, which went from around 1700 to 1842, the British East India Company and its army of private country traders profited by selling Indian opium using their returns to buy shiploads of tea. So the Brits would sell them opium and then they would buy from these 13 houses tea and carrying the leaves back to London in order to cash out their profits. वहाँ जाके वो बेचते थे. कितनी जबरदस्त चाय है, देखो पियो. On the demand side, Europeans and American trading companies actively worked to create domestic markets for tea throughout the 18th century with an eye towards enriching governments and paying for wars. Soon, the bourgeois and working classes of Western Europe had begun to drink tea with milk, sugar, and sweet pastries. Cup of tea, governor. You're supposed to drink the tea, you're supposed to keep your pinky up or whatever. Cup of tea. Ji.
Interesting, tea became so important. There was a Boston Tea Party in America.
Oh yes, exactly. Yes, it becomes extremely important. और उससे पहले, of course, the big drink in the in the West was either you had beer or you had wine, etc. But now you have tea, which wakes you up. It's so amazing. Okay, so and then you have tea with crumpets and pastry. So you get the sugar high. Yes.
I just have like a generic question. There's this notion created that Europe is more of like tea countries and America is more coffee based.
That's now true,
Yeah,
largely.
I noticed this like when I was there. So how do we like I mean, यहाँ पे लिखा हुआ on the demand side, European and American trading companies that was good. So was it equal at that time or did it eventually?
That this time, when we can look at the coffee trade some other time, but at this time, tea like dominates.
No, so tea was dominated in America as well.
Yes, yes, the production and consumption of tea is dominated.
So, whoa, it was interesting how they called it drug food because even Islamically, like anything that qualifies as drug is anything that alters your state of mind.
Right.
But and they're all
Your point.
saying even similarity.
Yeah, I mean it is, but it's not obviously so addictive as hard drugs or alcohol, etc. So for that reason, we don't classify it as quote unquote a drug. But I mean, it does alter your state of mind in that sense, and sugar also. So anyway, this became the whole thing. And now the interesting thing is कि जब आप वो क्या कहते हैं उसको जब रिश्ता आता है तो जो खातून है वो उसको माँ कहती है बेटा जरा चाय तो लेके आओ and she comes out reeling a trolley of tea, but it also has, of course, lots of sweets on it and sugar on it, etc., etc. So that puts it in a whole new light in terms of its past. You know how interesting that is. Obviously, at a time when there was no tea in India, they would not have been beta chai leke aao. They would probably have been some other ritual. I'm not sure what that ritual would be. But isn't that interesting that that ritual itself, which we associate to be, going back into some ancient tradition, is actually itself the product of recent capitalism. Shocking! Sir, I'm never going to look at rishtas the same way again. Okay, let me continue. I'm sure you, any, yes, questions?
I was just gonna add on there was this ad as well, Vital Chai Tea, उसमें जैसे divorce happening, तो चाय पीते हैं तो फिर उनकी नहीं आती.
Acha, okay. Point noted. G, for marriage counseling.
You mentioned like marriage is also just like a sociological concept. Some people or some writers also claim that marriage as an institution is also a product of capitalism.
Dude, I'd love to talk about that, but right now I'm talking about tea. Okay? So it'll be a long tangent to talk about marriage because we'll have to talk about patriarchy and various forms of marriage, but we're not going to go there right now. G.
Again, I keep coming back to the fact that we have tea on the eastern coast of China, but then there's also the tea producing house in Sri Lanka.
Abhi aate hain na? Amna, you're always like jumping ahead and so on. It's great, but you have to let me build up to the drama, All right. So okay. So you get the picture. Oh, by the way, my sister-in-law got married. She got engaged recently. I shouldn't be saying this on camera. I'll edit it out later. when she was getting engaged, तो हम सब उसको छेड़ रहे थे कि हाँ, फिर अब जाके चाय लेके आओ ना. So obviously she was like, I'm not getting any tea. You go get the tea. Anyway, so here let's have a look. Here is where the tea production in China is occurring. Okay, so you can see here's the dark areas are where there's major tea production. So it's all over China. It's quite amazing. So tea first appeared in European sources in the mid 16th century, found in Portugal and Italian accounts of China. It was first spelled as chai. What? Chai? Cha? Cho? Reflected its northern pronunciation. Its subsequent metamorphosis to tea, the pronunciation in southern Fujian, reflected that region's growing importance by the 1700s. So the reason you called it chai is because it comes from China. Yes, shocking. But बाद में is start calling it tea because when it began to come from Fujian, then that's when that name was then used, which is tea. Interesting. So it's not even an English word. It's a word that's kind of taken from the Chinese themselves. Over several centuries, Europeans and Americans grew in. Oh, by the way, when we say bartan, we call wo jo porcelain ka bartan hota, we call that china. Such fine china, which also comes out when you have your rishta. I don't know why we're on rishta today, but anyway. So China, because that was first made in China, so we continued calling it China. I mean, should have been a little more creative than that, but over several centuries, Europeans and Americans grew infatuated with tea, imbuing it with symbolic meanings, a reflection of morality, healthiness, and class, and gender, respectability, etc., etc. Oh, by the way, you should also talk to Amber Riaz, who told me recently that actually tea drinking is really bad for your health. Especially the way we make tea, which is we mix tea with doodh, and tea mixed with doodh actually creates a condition where the nutrients in your stomach don't get absorbed by your stomach acids, etc. So every Pakistani I know of will have a पहले तो खाना खाना पराठे परूठे ये वो फलां उसके बाद अच्छा सा मोटा सा डकार मार मे बी आई एम जस्ट टॉकिंग अबाउट पंजाबीज बट एनीवे अच्छा सा जब तो कहते हैं जब तक डकार नहीं मारा इसका मतलब खाना नहीं ठीक हजम हुआ डकार मारते हैं और फिर उसके बाद लाजमी उसी के ऊपर चाय पीते हैं and that actually destroys your stomach's ability to absorb that food that you just ate but we do it almost every single meal of the day. So sugar and caffeine became inseparable in Western European diets. The tea was grown in China and then also in India, which I'll tell you in just a bit. And the sugar, of course, was grown in the Caribbean with slave labor. So you had these massive sugar plantations.
Sugar didn't exist in Europe before mercantile
Yes!
corporations?
Shocking! Na sugar, na cotton, na chai, na coffee. कैसे अजीबोगरीब किस्म के लोग थे किधर रह रहे थे जंगलों में है ना कितनी शॉकिंग और ये वो चीजें थी that Asians almost took in many cases for granted, you know. So that tells you something. All right, tea was now associated also with class, you know. British East India Company started the growth of opium in Bengal in 1770. So the Brits needed something with which they could buy the tea. They loved the tea. They're like, oh my God, we really need to have the tea. So what do? In 1770, they said, all right, let's plant opium. The company arrogated to itself exclusive rights to cultivate and sell the drug. So they said, not only are we going to make opium, we are going to have a monopoly on making opium. Nobody else is allowed to make opium except for moi. Britain was able to overcome the unfavorable trade balance it contracted from its tea habit only by inflicting an even greater addiction on the Chinese in the form of opium imported from India. How's that? Yeah, that's called trade. Yeah, you have a trade balance. Acha, ye baat hai. We really like your tea. Here's a hard drug. Okay, enjoy that while you can. The twin monopolies over Indian opium and Chinese tea spawned the well-known, awesomely profitable triangular trade between Britain, India, and China. This triangular trade, now this is a different triangle from that other triangle in which we had that slave trade going on, produced profits that were pivotal to the birth of the English industrial capitalism and British Empire. So this was a pivotal trade for the British East India Company buy chai from China, produce opium from India, sell the opium to the Chinese, buy the tea from the Chinese, sell the tea here, etc., etc. That's how capitalism got off the ground. After 1830, there was a new phase though. The English desire for Chinese tea became a major motivation in the eventual military conflicts between the British and the Qing Empire. The Opium Wars, these are called. The French and British went to war for the right to sell opium and buy tea from China. So we call them the Opium Wars because they were selling the opium, but they were also buying the tea, and they wanted that. They said, how can you stop us from selling opium? Don't you believe in free trade? So the main slogan of the Opium Wars was free trade. It was a hand somewhere.
That's the thing I wanted to ask because I was getting confused about the Opium Wars. Because we covered that earlier. We talked about Opium Wars in our earlier lecture, so I just wanted to make sure that this is the same time.
Same war. Okay. Same time. 1842 May, the Chinese had to sign the Treaty of Nanjing after the British victory, and that opened up 5 new trading ports, also liberalizing the export of Chinese tea. So they got to sell the opium more, and they got to import the tea. At the same time, British officials in India championed tea cultivation in the northeast Brahmaputra Valley by using the same rhetoric of the Opium War hawks, claiming that Indian tea would destroy and annihilate the Chinese monopoly. So the Brits were saying, why we don't like the fact that we have to buy tea from these people. Why can't we mix the tea ourselves? So they said, all right, you know what we're going to do? Jahan pe hum pehle opium bana rahe, why don't we also make tea in India? That was the big plan, especially after the Opium Wars. When they started getting into trouble with the Chinese, they said, you know what, we got to have an alternative source. Let's build that. By 1889, export of Indian tea to Britain surpassed Chinese tea. By 1889, they accomplished it, and the whole tables had been turned. How did they do that? That's like something else. Look at the graph over here. So you see over here that you have Chinese tea, and it's going down, export of Chinese tea, and you have export of Indian tea, and boom, it just goes up, and the two things upar niche ho jate hain. Ji Amna.
Sure, Opium wars were fought so that they could keep buying tea and selling opium, but then they
Yeah,
cultivated it in India, which overtook the Chinese trade. Then why have the opium wars to begin with?
I know. I ask myself the same question. But do you think they care about that? I mean, these are hardcore war merchant capitalists. Okay, they don't care. कि oh चलो कोई नहीं हम यहाँ से बना लेते हैं. They're like, what? We can't sell opium in this country. We can't buy tea from this country. We're going to go to war now. Okay, and they made money from it. I mean, they're still continuing to make money from it. The opium wars are way back here, 1840s, 1842 to be exact. So you see that this transition occurs later, not then. But the opium wars start them on this thing, okay, we got to think of alternative sources. Now here's the interesting thing. When you study economics, they tell you demand and supply khud hi ho jata hai. But ye khud hi nahi ho raha. They are doing it with a deliberate plan. Okay, that's what I want you to learn about the history of capitalism. This is all planned. पीछे से कोई किसी का हाथ था खड़ा. Yes.
Can we say that among the institutions like the WTO and IMF free trade
हाँ.
in this, like in the old way, like it's a new way of translating saying free trade, open up borders and
Yeah, of course it is. But that's not the subject today. Okay, we'll come to that some other time. All right, so now here are the major tea producing regions. You can see now tea is being produced here and in India as well. Okay, so we're going to study how did this transition happen. कोई किसी का और का सवाल तो जी.
The opium wars होने के बाद did it stop? Did Britain stop
Buying
selling
tea?
opium?
No. Why would they go to war if they stopped it?
So they kept selling opium,
Yes.
but they stopped taking tea.
No, they continued taking tea. They continued selling opium.
Okay.
Yeah.
But we just saw the graph.
Sorry.
We just saw the graph.
वो तो बाद में है ना 1889 में जाके ओपियम वॉर्स तो 40s में है 1840s में है जी.
So you're still confused a little about the opium wars. Can you briefly summarize it?
Briefly summarize इस तरह है कि the king of the emperor of China said सारे नशाई बन गए हैं हमारे मुल्क में. तो he went to the to the गोदाम्स in Canton and he said जला दो इसको ओपियम को और उसने जला दी सारी ओपियम. और the Brits were so unhappy with that. वो ब्रिटिश ओपियम थी. उन्होंने कहा हम तो जंग करेंगे आपके खिलाफ. आपने हमारे सारे गोदाम तबाह कर दिए. तो जंग हुई. जंग होने के बाद वो जो है वो emperor said okay I accept your everything. That's the history. जी.
So if 1840s led to opium war and in 1889 we're seeing the overtake of Indian chai, that means in 50 years, with the intensive farming and everything, Indian supply was surpassing Chinese tea supply.
Yes, you're like always jumping like 5 slides ahead. सुनो ना अभी कैसे हुई कहानी कैसे हुई सुने अगर मैं ना बताऊं तो फिर मुझसे पूछें ना. So सुने कैसे हुई. The first export tea sold in Canton were produced by monasteries in Fujian. The monks would sell the tea to the guest merchants. Although they added labor to the product, merchants expended almost all their energy on transport and circulation. The Huizhao were the most well-known of such Chinese merchants who would sell to the foreign merchants. और उनके अंदर एक saying थी, it's not a town without the Huizhao merchants. So I'm capturing for you कि China में tea production कैसे होती थी. The monks would produce it, they would sell it to these merchants, etc. Okay. By the late 19th century, the Scottish firm Jardine, Matheson and Co., the largest foreign opium and tea dealer in China, relied on tea men during the first decades of the treaty port era. Both silk and cotton were organized by a collection of powerful, almost monopolistic cliques of brokers who coordinated production and distribution on behalf of foreign firms. So you had these brokers, and they would get a hold of silk, cotton, and tea. During this 19th century era of expansion, the lines between merchant and industrial capitalists, circulation, finance, and manufacture were blurred, defying any tidy characterization between pre-modern and modern patterns of capitalism. Okay, so it's kind of all rolled into one: production and trading, etc. Now, production could always be roughly divided into 2 stages in China at that time. Kya stages the? An initial processing called chuji, followed by a reprocessing called zheji. Please, if you're Chinese, I'm sure you want to kill me by now, but main kya karoon. More commonly called refinement, jingji, okay, or jingji, I don't know. Oh my God, who is how? Factory managers controlled only the second stage, and merchants relied upon peasant households to provide the raw materials. By contrast, merchants in the UE Mountains oversaw the entire process from cultivation to packaging. So these were the two main areas in which this production would occur. And in one region, which is the Huizhou region, it was the peasants would produce it, and then these brokers would buy it up. And in the other area, the merchants would oversee the entire process of production. Now, within the Chinese tea trade, the most obvious form was a division of tasks along gendered lines. Women were hired to pluck leaves on private gardens, and seasonal factories hired both men and women to work together in manufacture. This was, though, already in violation with the Confucius ethics of men plow and women weave. So, if you think about, when I read this was very interesting for me to read because when we talk about, the government that we have in Afghanistan, they also want to go back to this kind of system, that men will be in the public realm and women will do the domestic labor, etc., and then therefore they don't need to go to school and college and university, etc. So it's interesting to find that, in fact, even in ancient China, you have the same gendered division of labor. So, the rise of industrial capitalism coincided with qualitative changes in the perception and consciousness of time amongst workers and farmers. This we know from any study we do of European capitalism, that people started becoming more and more conscious of time. They started keeping mechanical clocks, etc. The same thing, though, the author argues, was going on in Chinese tea production with the burning of incense. So they didn't have mechanical clocks, but they did keep track of time and in terms of production. The way they would do that is, incense timekeepers were available in various lengths and burning speeds, but they were generally designed to last 40 minutes per stick. So you had an incense stick, ठीक है, एक हम भी करते हैं कभी कभार, वो जलाते हैं, क्या कहते हैं, अगरबत्ती, राइट, तो वो 40 मिनट में बुझती है जाके, उनकी जो थी, ठीक है. So उससे they would keep track of time and they would say that this task requires 3 sticks to complete, this task requires 2 sticks to complete, etc. So they did not have mechanical clocks necessarily, but that didn't mean that they were not now looking at production in relation to time. So what is the author trying to tell you here? The interesting thing that the author is trying to tell you is, already, because of the way in which this global trade for tea is now occurring, the workers of China are becoming more and more time conscious, just like the workers of Europe became more and more time conscious when they were working on those machines. So, and also these incense sticks served as a basis for determining remuneration, in other words, pay. Okay, so you burnt 5 sticks in your work, that means I'll give you this much money. You burnt 10 sticks, you did more time, so I'm going to give you this much money. So, they was also used to keep, to determine कि पैसे कितने देने हैं मजदूरों को, laborers को. So then we had a labor management system, the Bao Tao system. Again, don't blame me for wrong pronunciation, okay? So Tao meant leader, and the contractor system known as Bao Gong, where Bao means contract derived from its original meaning as concealed package, and Gong means labor. So you had a whole labor, you now developed a whole labor management system. And these people who were now the Bao Tao were basically the Vaderas, etc., right? They were the seniors of the village or the Badas of the village. In the tea trade, the Bao Tao's most important occupational requirement was the ability to communicate with both workers and merchants. Interestingly, the Chinese workers and the Chinese merchants didn't necessarily speak the same language. And of course, the Europeans didn't speak the same language. So one of the things that they had to do was communicate between all these workers and peasants and workers, and as well as merchants and foreign merchants. The halting tea plucking at the same time. By halting tea plucking at the same time, the tea master, that is the Bao Tao, established a baseline for measuring each worker's output and efficiency. So they would say, okay, we're going to take a cigarette break now, we're going to take a smoking break. They didn't have cigarettes, but they had smoke. They used to smoke stuff. We're going to take a smoking break, and then they would check, अच्छा आपकी basket में कितनी tea leaves आपने इकट्ठी की. And this way, that's like spot checking your production. So, and whichever worker had collected the least, they would have to carry a red flag down the mountain that particular night to their abode, etc., because you go up to the mountain to pluck the tea. So in that way, you were incentivized, oh, I'm not carrying the red flag tomorrow, so this is not a political red flag, this is not a communist red flag or anything. So, you said, meri badi besti hui, I had to carry the red flag. I should have this in my classes. Next time you guys are late or something, I'll put a red flag on you or something, I don't know. So in this way, you can see that the foreign trade with international merchants is already reshaping the way in which this production process is occurring. It's making them more time conscious. It's making them burn the incense to calculate what time is being used. It's making them introduce a labor management system and all these other things. So what the author is trying to explain to us is that although this is a pre-capitalist form of production, but it's already integrated into the world capitalist economy. The most recent centuries of Chinese, indeed world history, have been distinguished not by the presence of any particular technical feature, but rather the unprecedented degree to which the social compulsion to grow and produce for the world market has come to dominate everyday life. So one thing that's happened now is this compulsion to grow, produce, output, vagara. Now this becomes something that the Chinese are also copying in tea production because of the pressure coming from the merchants who are saying, we want more, we want more, we want more. So he's saying, what the person is saying is that you have to understand that this is kind of the beginnings of capitalism in China, because it's occurring through foreign merchants, is occurring in this particular way rather than beginning with the emergence of wage labor as such. Yes.
So instead of thinking as we usually did, okay, at the start of capitalism there was a time when efficiency was, there was a time during the start of capitalism where efficiency was focused on and people slowly got better at their job. Even before capitalism there was a time when efficiency was being increased.
Yeah, but here the person is arguing that this is not before capitalism. This is because of capitalism. That's the key argument that they're trying to make, is that we have constantly characterized the tea production of India or China in the 19th century as being pre-capitalist. But actually it's very much part of the global capitalist enterprise. It's part of it. Yeah, I guess maybe you can put it that way, but if they don't want to put it that way either. I don't have a chalk except anything. Oh, here it is. But think of it this way. There's a capitalist system sitting on top, and on the bottom of that system are sitting all kinds of pre-capitalist modes of production. And now that capitalist system at the top is driving those pre-capitalist modes of production in an entirely new way, driving them faster and faster, making them more conscious of efficiency and output and management and blah, blah, blah. So it's changing it from the top down. Yes.
Doesn't that just make them capitalist modes of production then?
It makes it a...
If they're not technical, doesn't mean they're not
Yeah,
capitalist.
that's their argument. It makes it a kind of articulation of two modes of production. So you have a pre-capitalist mode of production and boom, you have capitalism on top, and they get, they hybridize into this system. That's the point. They hybridize into this system. And that's the beginning of capitalism. So this hybridization of these two systems is what we also refer to as the articulation of the modes of production. That is how two modes of production fit into each other, articulate into each other, and which one of the two modes of production dominates and drives the other. So here you can clearly see it's capitalism that's driving the entire system, and the other system is changing because of capitalism. So that's what we're referring to here. Okay, so by the turn of the 20th century, they had developed a standardized system for timed labor that demanded speed and coordination. Ultimately, it was these same social dynamics of competition-inspired intensification that would draw Chinese tea producers towards capital-intensive and mechanical methods in the 20th century. So they did transition now to industrial capitalism with wage labor and new technology and new machines, etc. But this is how it occurred. Okay, you have this pre-capitalist mode of production almost, it's operating on its own pace, its own speed, which is a kind of slow speed. And then comes capitalism from on top, catches a hold of it and says, all right, everybody, shape up or ship out. We're going to work faster and faster and faster and faster. And boom, the whole system gets, kind of sucked in and transformed, almost stretched by how the merchants are pulling in the produce from this pre-capitalist labor relationship. Avais?
Instead of thinking that there was sort of a revolution which changed everything that comes into wage labor,
Yes.
over time, different parts of the world changed into it.
Yes, this is the transition. This is describing how that transition occurred. When capitalism gets a hold of this pre-capitalist mode and churns it and churns it into something new. Yes.
तो हमारा criticism ये है कि क्या कहते हैं, from what I understand, कि जो capitalism कर रहा है, it's basically not producing because there's need, but producing because the British Empire needs profits.
I mean, that's not the argument here. That's true in and of itself, but that's not what's being stated here. You have to think about the literature on the subject of capitalism. The literature on the subject of capitalism seems to suggest that capitalism only is something that was born in England And though if you study England, we'll understand capitalism. Now what the author is trying to explain to you is that English capitalism from the very beginning was connected to everything that was going on in Asia, Africa, and the American continent. And what was going on in these other parts of the world is that all these other pre-capitalist modes of production, slavery being one, serfdom in the part of Eastern Europe, patriarchal forms of labor and tribal and other forms of labor. Capitalism is getting a hold of each and every one like a. And now once it gets a hold of them, it's not just that it has a hold on them, then it begins to draw them into its own orbit and into its own pace of work. It begins to change them by changing the very pace of work. That's the argument. So this is not, it's a description of what capitalism is doing. It's not, you have to, again, get out of that moralistic frame, capitalism, good or bad, I don't care. I'm trying to explain to you how did capitalism change the third world, India and China in particular. This is how the process occurred. Okay? All right. So let's continue. Okay, actually, let's not continue. Let's take a 5-minute break and then I'll talk about India. Okay?